Happy 2 days after July 4th, when we really celebrate the renewal of democracy and really perhaps the birth of really people-led democracy, using Latin vox populi. And we all know that democracy can be quite messy and illogical at times, and yet there doesn't seem to be a better system out there. Being a New York born and bred lover of public transit, we know that congestion pricing was supposed to start last week, and yet the vox populi, in my opinion, illogically voted and said, we don't want this, we don't want to be nickeled and dimed, even though over 80% of the people who commute into Manhattan take public transportation. And we certainly, I think most of us, understand the environmental need to cut the congestion and just the time and headache. It would be great if we could cut the congestion. But democracy is messy and illogical, and yet we celebrate it with holidays and we say, isn't it wonderful when the people can speak up and don't have the tyranny of an autocratic leader behind us. This is part 2 of my 5-part seminar in conservative Judaism and really how it affects us. Last week, I went through sort of the history of modernity meeting the Jewish people and Judaism, and how in the beginning, we used the Mendelssohn family as an example, where Moses Mendelssohn was able in his heart to say, I love Judaism, and yet I'm not forced to observe it. I'm choosing to observe it. There is no external forcing me to do it at the threat of being excommunicated. And he thought he had a way of keeping people Jewish. But yet, his own children felt the need to convert out in order to succeed in this new modern world. And so I brought up that was going to bring, and obviously we don't have a college seminar, of decades of discussion and just living it out. What does it mean to be Jewish in an age of both autonomy as well as living in the greater society with lots of different pressures? Pressures obviously developing over time to move farther away from the synagogue as people own automobiles. Pressures to work on Saturday, and especially back then in a world that was a 6-day work week, Monday through Saturday. And if you wanted to make, not even just ends meet, but to make it somewhere financially for your family and your family to move on and move up the economic ladder, to live the American dream, some people felt compelled to work on Saturdays. And so we have this idea of tradition and change. And even as ourselves, where tradition meets change. And what happens when that meets? Ideally, it was supposed to be the rabbis, the specialists, that would tell you how to do this and would use their logic and find the leniencies that do exist and the ability to change. Because as we studied Judaism, the study of Judaism was part of modernity, we could see that there was indeed change. Despite the theology, there was a theology that said that God gave all of the oral Torah at Sinai, and that there really was no change. But upon further study, there was change. So there was the ability to change. But by the time the book came out, edited by Rabbi Mordecai Waxman, Tradition and Change came out in 1958. It was already the case where the Vox Populi seemed to be taking over. So what is Waxman's book about? I don't have copies of the book for everybody, but later on, if you'd like, I have copies of a review written in 1958 by Milton Himmelfarb in Commentary Magazine. And Himmelfarb was a sociologist himself. And by the way, at the time, you could get the 477-page book for $4.50. And he brings up in the review just this struggle, and by the way, the illogic between the rabbis and the people, because Judaism is lived in the heart. And so he points out, and basically what this is, it's a collection of primary sources of the founders of conservative Judaism, okay, including Salman Schechter and others. And in that he points out, and probably what was happening right here in this very room, was that you had Jews who worked on Shabbat, so they were not punctilious in how they observed Shabbat, and yet, perhaps referring to our friends up the street at the time, they said everybody must cover their head if they're gonna be in the sanctuary. You have to cover your head. Now, if you ask a rabbi, which is the more important practice? What would you rather a Jew do? Observe Shabbat or cover their head if they had to choose? The answer would be observe Shabbat. Covering our head is custom. It's not written in the Torah. Where it's mentioned in the Talmud, it's all custom. So where does this, punctilious, they were really punctilious. They would run up to somebody if they were bareheaded in the synagogue. I can just imagine that. But yet they would go shopping on Shabbat. Where is that? And so we see here that it's the people that really do decide, with rabbis as well, and that's what's sort of the tradition and change. Maybe we even change the title of it, sort of, specialized leadership versus vox populi. So let's go to today. I'll speak personally, obviously, as a rabbi. What do I think about this? Should the power lie in the people, or should the power lie in specialized rabbis? I think the people already have the power anyway, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that because that allows me to be a teacher. And I've learned this as a teacher. When you teach and empower people to make the choice themselves, they'll make the right choice for themselves. I might not agree with it, but certainly if we're also concerned about the transmission of Judaism to the next generation, and I have been to Shiva houses, where they talk about eating their pork spare ribs, but at the same time contributing to the state of Israel and saying Kaddish with a knowledge of the Hebrew and knowledge of what they are saying. So, am I going to close my ears? They also often say that, Rabbi, close your ears. And I don't. When they talk about the foods they eat, yes, I don't personally eat them. If they were amenable, I could have a discussion with them about why I think kashrut brings value to your life. But I'm also going to say, great that you support Israel. It is so great, and it's so good to see the next generations gathered together, remembering a loved one in a Jewish context. Because remember the Mendelssohn family. Remember they had to convert out in their minds in order to live their peace. What I don't approve of as a rabbi is when you sort of change the law in to me sort of in a real inappropriate way to permit what the congregations are doing. And so most famously, similar decade as tradition and change, is this permission from rabbis to drive on Shabbat. Most of you drove here. I don't want to say I don't care, but it doesn't factor into my judgment of you, and I love and want to teach you all together. But if you're going to ask me sort of intellectually, Rabbi, is it kosher to drive a combustion engine? We'll get to electric cars another time. But is it kosher to drive a combustion engine like rabbis did in the 1950s? And I'm going to say I don't agree. A combustion engine, what you're doing is lighting a fire in those pistons. Do not light a fire on the Shabbat day, the Torah says. Okay, I can't get my way around that. Now, yes, there are other things that we do. We do have the idea to ignore, at least in our practice, parts of the Torah. And certainly we do that. We do that with the humility, but we recognize that the world has changed. And so if a divorcee is going to marry a Kohen and they're Jewish, and the Talmud says that those weddings are kosher weddings, then, and we don't practice in the temple anymore, I'm going to say, you know what? For the sake of Jewish continuity and recognizing a new world, a more egalitarian world that we also bring into existence here, that is okay. Is it messy? You betcha. You bet it's messy. Many of you drove here, and yet we're observing Shabbat together. But like democracy, it is one of the best things that are out there. And your teaser for next week is how do we live with pluralism? Because we are all going to choose different things. So more simply, a community where some people walk and some people drive, some people keep kosher, some do not in the same way. How do we live in a pluralistic world that can see the Judishness and obviously the humanity in each other? Stay tuned to next week. Shabbat Shalom.